Hello and praise the Lord. I'm Pat Lawson-Muse. Grief and loss can often leave us with questions. Why? Why did this happen? Why did it happen to me? But while it's perfectly normal, it's human to ask the question. Our healing is often not contingent on getting the answers we're looking for. Social worker Brandi Wimbish explores the bigger question of how we could heal at the Arc of Safety's recent seminar on grief and loss.
Good morning, everyone. So, I want to say thank you all. I want to thank your First Lady, your leadership, the team that invited me. I always know when God has me on assignment, and I'm being clear. Miss China asked me to do this, and when she asked me to do it, I was like, okay, sure, yeah, I'll do it. And I had written this whole presentation up in my brain, what I was going to do. And within the last 72 hours, I'm like, God, tell me what you want me to do. How do you want me to be used? And one thing I know is God speaks to me very clearly, and he gives it to me in black and white because he knows that's exactly how I need it. And so within the last 72 hours, I was telling China, it's been an interesting couple of days for me, which is so out of the norm. Everything's usually going pretty, it flows pretty well. And then this week, something just kind of happened and threw me off. And I got here today and I was like, okay, Lord, I don't really feel like I'm on today. What's that about? And which was great because it allowed me to sit and hear the need in the room. And so as I'm sitting in the back, I started to pivot and say, okay, God, you want me to speak a little bit differently about this subject than I was going to speak about it. So yes, I am a therapist, but I'm also a person. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I am a friend, and I am someone who has worked with people personally, professionally, but I have actually experienced grief and loss specifically. And the gentleman in the back shared something that I immediately connected with. He said, being an only child, I heard that word come up. I am an only child. And I was the only child of my mother when she died. And I think that literally took me on a journey to kind of do things differently. I was already kind of working in this space, but it definitely opened up my feelings about it, my thoughts about it, and God's use, what he's called me to do. So that being said, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of that so you can understand I'm not just up here like a professor. It's actually coming from a different place. So I'm using two roles here. I want to say good morning. I wanted to highlight again, this is a tough subject. And I encourage each of you to take care of yourself. If you need to step out, step out. The good news is, even though we're not here in official capacity, I know there's therapists in the room. And grief is not just about loss. I want to say thank you for the previous presentation. It was actually spot on. It covered all of the different types of grief, which makes it easier for me to not have to do that. I was going to go down these are the kind of griefs you experienced and all of those things. But the one that I know that I was meant to talk about today is the one I'm going to talk about, which is understanding complicated grief, navigating loss when healing feels stuck. I heard complicated grief in here so much. That's why I was like, okay, I was definitely meant to talk about this because I initially was thinking ambiguous loss, which is what you were talking about. So that being said, we're going to roll into it. So what is grief? Grief is the loss of something. And it's, as we heard earlier, it does not always mean it's a person. And why is this so important? Why is this subject coming up right now? So within the last 6 months, we have all experienced some grief. And it's been ambiguous grief, meaning everything going on in the state of our country right now, in the state of our nation, the state of our lives, is creating a grief response that we don't really consider grief, right? So in December, China and I presented on ambiguous loss, and we were talking about the loss from grief or election grief. People didn't even realize you could have election grief, but the need was in front of us. People were kind of dysregulated. They were uncertain and they didn't really understand what was going on. And so we put together this presentation and explained that you can actually have a loss related to something like a grief or like an election and not even realize that that's what's happening for you. And that has nothing to do with your politics, how you voted, any of that. It just means the way things were is not the way they are now, and I lost something. And a lot of times we can't really put our finger on the loss, and especially with ambiguous loss. So for today's purpose, I'm going to be specifically focusing on complicated grief. Am I skipping this? There we go. So first and foremost, grief is a natural response. It's what we are supposed to do. I heard someone say, these emotions come up. And then I also heard someone say, there's a burst. In clinical language, we use the word trigger. And the thing is, triggers are supposed to happen and people don't think they're supposed to happen. They don't want them to happen. And how do I get rid of these triggers or these bursts? You don't. It's not just about death. It's about the process that happens in your brain regarding the loss. So the death is one part of it. And then it depends on how you experience the death, what the death was, and that takes you to a very different place. And that's why I said, I can talk about this personally and professionally. And I will tell you a little bit how I dealt with it. Have you ever felt like your grief wasn't valid or it wasn't being acknowledged? Okay. So now, what is complicated grief? The thing that I want to talk about so much today. Complicated grief, when someone comes in our office, right, as therapists, we look at it as like this heightened state of you just are mourning and it's not going anywhere. And the best way to describe it is someone is experiencing a prolonged grief or intense grief, right? And if you look at these words, everybody knows what these words are. You're either avoiding. There's this word called rumination, meaning I'm playing it over and over and over and over and over and over again in my head. And then there's this emotional numbness. I heard that in here, I had this grief, and then I kind of lock it up. I only talk to certain people, and then I feel like I kind of let it out. But then when I'm not talking to those people, I'm numbing it up. I'm shutting it up. I'm not talking about it. I'm not going to feel it. Right? Inability to move forward or function. So can't get past the actual death of the person. And then the physical symptoms, they can look like this or they can look like nothing at all. So insomnia just essentially means sleep. You have some kind of sleep disturbance. Pain. You can start to feel like you have physical chronic pain and you're going to the doctor and they're saying absolutely nothing's wrong with you. I mean, there's nothing going on. Well, my head hurts and now I feel like my heart's pumping out of my chest and I can't breathe and I'm having all these troubles. And then there's the emotional pain. And the emotional pain is probably most likely what's driving everything else, because the reality is we don't want to feel the pain. And we get really good. And I'm going to tie this into being Black people, brown people, anybody that's been disenfranchised people, other people. We experience it a little bit differently when there's a loss because of the history. Wherever there's hysteria, there is history. And what do I mean by that? If something happens and we suddenly are just like hysterical on the inside, like I can't function, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just like this, that means there's a history that has been embedded in us somewhere that never got addressed. So if you think of it like this, if you've ever injured yourself, cut yourself, and you didn't clean it out correctly, and it gets infected and it burns like crazy, but you keep avoiding getting it cleaned up, and it's burning and it's burning and burning, and it gets worse and worse and worse, then what happens is that thing is still there. And emotional pain is exactly that. People show up in our offices, hopefully, because that emotional pain has gotten infected. They don't know what to do with it. It's too tough. I can't handle it. Make sense? Okay. So what we have and what we think of grief is, we think of grief in the sense of what should happen is if someone dies or something happens like, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, what we call collective grief, because that goes back to why I said as Black folks, brown folks, white folks, other folks who have been disenfranchised in some kind of way, we have a different way of grieving because we tend to grieve as a group, right? And especially like if you think of when there's like a George Floyd situation, we grieve very differently, right? We don't have to know the person. We grieve differently. Angie Stone, we may not have ever met her, but we grieve very differently. We grieve as a group. So the idea of what is normal and what we should do is we should grieve in about 2 to 3 weeks, year at best, be done. You hear the situation, you go to the funeral, and you ought to go on home and be done with it. Correct? That's what the thought is. And why does that complicate our grief? Because while we may think that's what's supposed to happen, the human body, the human experience does not work that way. And again, if there's history, there is hysteria. And if you touch that old wound, it is going to burn like crazy and get away from you. So the first year, what I have found, and I always say this, in the first year, what I try to really work with and I try to help people understand is we are programmed in that first year to focus on why. Anybody relate? Why did this happen? How did this happen? Why didn't I do this? Why did I do that? Right? Why? And that's normal because as humans, we are programmed to know the why. We want to know the why, right? And then why didn't it happen to me? And that complicates it a little bit more. But our whole thing is the why. Now, the reality is that is not how you properly grieve. But it is absolutely normal because our minds are not conditioned to think it's okay for someone to die. We can't wrap our minds around that. And that's normal. It's human beings. So year 1 is shock, disbelief, numbness. Year 2, deeper realization of absence. Year 3, grief doesn't follow a timeline. Year 4, timeline alone doesn't heal, processing does. I put this up here for a reason because this is like if you were to go to look online, it's going to tell you these are the phases, these are the stages, and this is what should happen. And the reality is, 1, this can never happen if you don't ever touch it. The only thing that could actually ever happen is the grief and being stuck. And those feelings and bursts going on and on and on and wreaking havoc on your relationships, on your health, on your family, on your functioning, on everything. That can happen. Or you can go through a loss and kind of like, oh, I'm good. And then 3 years later, you're having issues and you're trying to figure out what the heck is going on with me because you didn't deal with it. And what do we mean by deal with it? Dealing with it looks different for everyone, right? So first 2 years is survival mode, usually. That actually is true. What happens is there's a feeling of numbness and disbelief, and it usually disrupts our routines. And it's this sense of unreality. Why? Because what's predictable is that person or that situation is now no longer there. And it's kind of out of our sphere, out of our ability to understand something has changed. Something's been lost. Year 2 should be the reality of loss. So now, whether or not we're numbing or not, our brain's kicking in and saying, okay, this has actually happened. That doesn't mean we're dealing with it. But now I'm able to come out of the first 2 years and say, okay, oh my God, this thing did happen. And I can feel something in my body, feel stronger, but some people might feel it. Some people might keep on pushing it away. And if you're like me, anybody in here cook, anybody use pressure cookers, any of that? Yeah, if you don't, even the new ones, if you mess around, don't let the pressure out, it is going to explode. Human beings will do that exact same thing. Okay? And then if we haven't done it, and addressed it, year 2 can feel a lot harder. So what makes grieving and grief harder is what I call complicators. So complicators is first and foremost the why thing that I said, right? If you are in the space the first year where you're like, I don't know the why. I can't understand the why. So I am going to use myself in this example, which I don't do, but I'm not in therapy, so I'm going to use disclosure. When my mom died, and she didn't die, she was murdered. I'm using words that I didn't use back in the day. My mom was murdered, and I was about 20-some years old, very young, and an only child. And I was full-blown numb and mentally 1,000% out of it. And I was in charge of doing the funeral, everything, anything you can think of, I had to do it. And there was a lot of things that went into it because of the type of situation it was. And so at the time, I had a lot going on. I was doing all this stuff, and I had some support. Once the funeral was over, I remember I had 2 breakdowns, and I'm saying breakdowns. One, the day it happened, the day I was informed of it, which was that night. And then at the funeral. After that, I started pushing people away. I wouldn't even say push them away. I just pretty much cut them off. Stopped answering their calls unless I wanted to talk to you. Because what would happen is people would walk up and say, what happened? And that was starting to be a problem, right? And not that people intend to do that, but they do it. And back then I wouldn't have known because I certainly wasn't doing this work, right? So I was like, all right. So I started kind of like, all right, this is too much. And so I wasn't talking about it at all, not even with the family. None of us were talking about it either. And so then the problem started to happen with me. And I was like, what is going on? Like I was getting forgetful and little things like that. And long story short, you end up having to do the work. So, but because of that, why? Like I said, I was frozen at the beginning, but then I wanted to know what happened. Like I knew what happened in the beginning. I knew what they told me. I knew kind of what was going on. And then I didn't want to know anything else because it was too painful. And then once I kind of came to and got with the present, now I want to know why. The real why. My first why, though, that was the complicator, was why didn't I answer my mom's call the night she called me? And it was that night and I was asleep. Why didn't I pick up the phone? Why did I tell myself, oh my goodness, I'll call her as soon as I wake up? That's what my brain did. That's exactly the story I told myself. And that's the story that led me to feeling extreme guilt, which is why I was numb. Guilt because I didn't answer her call. So that is what we call a complicator. And then why did this happen? That was the family that was talking to me, which I started to feel like, okay, this is too much. Now, the question is, and the strategy is, and the intention of what I'm going to share with you is, at some point, and hopefully today you get it from me so you don't wait as long as I did, go from knowing that it does hurt and it isn't fun. However, we have to move from the why to why did they die to how do I want to live? Why did they die? Why did that happen? Why did we this, that, and the other? And we can go back to this election because that's important. Whatever you feel or don't feel, people are hurting. And so instead of why is he this, that, the third, which is a lot of it because we can't help it, how do I want to function? What do I have control over? Who do I want to be despite what they're doing? How do I take control back of me? So when you have those bursts are coming from not acknowledging them and saying, okay, how do I want to live? Because they're more frequent when you're trying to push them away. Okay. Another complicator, and this is why I deliberately kind of started writing notes. I was like, forget the PowerPoint. A biggie, personalization. So when I said the why, now let's do the other part of the personalization. Anybody in here know what that means? When you personalize the death and make it kind of like something about you or something about a situation. So for example, let's say I gave you mine. Why didn't I? But I didn't blame myself for the issue. I just felt bad about that I didn't answer. But let's say, for example, you have plans to go to dinner with someone and you're like, gosh, I'm tired, or you forgot, or you didn't make it. And then you find out that they were in a horrible car accident or something to that effect. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to trigger anyone if that experience happened, but it is a true thing. I have them come in my office all the time and I've experienced this. But you have something like that where you're too busy and you didn't catch up with somebody, and then you had plans and then you didn't make it. And then you find out that at that moment in time that this event happened. And then you personalize it. If I had done this, then that wouldn't happen. And I'm going to tell you that's not true. It cannot happen. There's no evidence that had you been there, it wouldn't have happened. That's not true. So complicated grief has these complicators. One, the why didn't I do this? And that comes with guilting yourself, which gets in the way of healing. Two is personalizing it, which is 100% normal because we kind of just naturally want to do it. Here's what I will say. The pain of someone dying is inevitable. We're going to experience pain if we're human beings and we care, and we're not like this chair or some people who we clearly know don't care about other people. But suffering is optional. Suffering is optional. The blame we do, in a lot of ways, has to do with just the initial randomness of a death, right? Even if we expect it, it feels so random. We think there just has to be a reason. There has to be a reason. And that's just our human programming. If we have intellectual curiosity, we're going to want to know why. But by the same token, it is super duper important to understand that this pain I have is okay and it's supposed to happen. But the suffering is optional. I have a choice. I do not have to suffer. Okay? So the loved one did not die because I didn't go to that dinner. The loved one did not die because I didn't make a phone call. The loved one did not die because the nurse did whatever. That's kind of where we like our brains to go. And the guilt is something related to us. The stigma is other people. It's the external world that stigmatizes it. And so I'll use this particular one because it is a complicated grief. One of the complicated griefs that stands out for most people is if there's been a death by suicide. There's what we call suicide completion. And as therapists, this is extremely hard for us, even though we know these things. We're very aware of these things. It's very complicated for us to make sure we did everything we could do. But the reality is, even if we did that death by suicide, death by completion, we absolutely have to understand there is nothing at all that we could do to control that decision or that outcome. So here's a good way to think of grief instead of thinking of it in this early grief thing. This is great and this helps, and it helps us learn some things, and it is a good tool, but let's do a little visual imaging in our brain. So think of grief more like it's a river, right? And our grief flows. So first, when the first thing happens, if we have a death experience, put that little toe in the water. So that might be, this is the first introduction to this grief. Now, it has an unpredictable current, though. Each person, each individual, each situation, we don't know how that's going to work for that person. You don't know how it's going to work till you experience it. But we know it can gently pull us, or it can be a raging river, and it can pull us under the current. It can gently push us forward. It's like being stuck on a rock in the river sometimes. Other times, we are sitting back watching everyone else go on, just like a river. So, right? So say, for example, you are kind of on a log instead of in the water moving around. So what that kind of feels like and looks like is life moves, but we don't. So do we want to hop in that current? I think it's pretty important to do it. So the gentle part, the rough part is meant to get us where we need to go, and it helps us move forward. So healing requires movement, not force, at your own space, but it does require movement. It involves letting go of the idea of controlling the process. So I'm going to try and control these bursts. I'm going to try and control these triggers. Hey, I need these things to get out of here, Brandy. How do I get rid of these triggers? And, I'm very honest. You don't. Because if we had to answer that, boy, we would be in heaven, right? So when you still feel stuck in grief, what helped or hindered you from moving forward? I want you to think about that. Anybody that has that going on or has experienced the grief, which I can say, even if it wasn't a personal loss, we have all experienced a grief, even if it was an ambiguous loss, right? It like losing a paycheck, losing a job, moving from a house, having a pet die. All of these things are griefs, right? And there's also what we call vicarious grief, but we're not going to focus on that today. So some other common complicators, and I want to highlight these. Sudden or traumatic loss. My mom was definitely a complicator because I was not expecting that. Loss of a young child or a young person. That makes it complicated because our brain cannot wrap itself around this age group, right? Multiple losses in a short time. Be very clear. You cannot group loss. You can only grieve one at a time. We tend to say, oh, God, I have 5 deaths in 1 month, and that can happen. But you can't grieve the group. You have to grieve it one at a time. Lack of a support system. Human beings need to be in connection with human beings. The gentlewoman in here who said, there are people that I gravitate towards, that's a great thing because you feel safe there. But it just hasn't happened where the grief is getting processed outside of that. But you're going to connect with people you feel safe with because your grief feels safe. So suppressed or delayed grief. Well, all of us kind of sort of do that. You got to get in there and work it out, and it hurts. Now, real quick, because I want to make sure we get to this part. Any questions so far? Any comments? Okay. So the importance. From the why to the how. Why did this happen? How do I live with this? Anybody in here that is stuck right now, write that down. Why is first, and then how do I live with this? A lot of times I hear people say, I was hoping this, and then I was going to start living. I was hoping this, I was going to start living. I get that a lot. And then I get a lot. So shifting from meaning seeking, we want to shift from looking for the meaning to, that's kind of not coming up as big as it should. So you guys probably can't really see it all the way. Because I can't. And then grief evolves. Well, so does our healing. If we don't allow ourselves to know that things grow and they change and we're still living, then we also think grief can't grow and change and live. It has to evolve, right? Otherwise, if the grief feels stuck, then we feel stuck. But the truth is, we're not stuck, which is why we're having such a hard time. Because if I'm alive and breathing and I'm not feeling like I'm moving, that goes against who I am as a human being, and that's tough. But it is not easy, and there are ways to get help. And you got a whole lot of it in here. I don't know how to get this to look like it needs to. That's okay. So, and I want to make sure I do this for you all. Okay. Anybody ever have this thought in mind? Is there actually life after death? A lot of people come and ask that. And anybody ever have that thought about a grief that they've experienced? How will I live after this? How can I have a life after this? How long will the grief last? And the reality is, what would your relative want for you? Right? What would you want for you? And how long will the grief last? Well, it lasts the way it lasts. And grief is not, it doesn't have a period on it. It doesn't have an endpoint, but it absolutely can look different. Remember, I said the pain is real. The suffering can be very different. So how do we start to heal? So 3 things, because I know we have to tighten up and wrap up. First is coming here. We have a habit of dismissing ourselves. And there's a reason we do it. Usually it happens in childhood, or some experience happens and we have feelings and we don't want to deal with them, or somebody didn't really see them and help us learn how to process them. And so we learn that's a coping skill. And I will go back to anybody that's ever been in a situation where they've been oppressed or hurt or controlled, or definitely Black and brown folks. We have learned how to kind of push ourselves away so we can function. And we do that in most spaces, and we try and do it when we have a grief. The challenge is when it's personal, it's much harder to do it. And we're trying to control something that we can't control. So what we're having is feelings that we're not familiar with. So we don't have the ability to name those feelings. And that's why they start to take over our bodies. So what do? There's a couple of things. One, of course, I'm going to say therapy, and it's therapy either with someone, and this is my recommendation, is if you have a grief counselor and you feel most comfortable with church, do it with church. I personally always recommend do not do it with your church. Go outside of your church, just like therapy. Now, I am definitely a proponent of therapy because, one, I'm a therapist, but because I also understand when you're in a therapist's office, there's a very different experience. One, you're not alone. Two, it allows you have a skilled person, and hopefully someone that is subject matter expert in grief. So they know how to meet you where you are, not drag you to where they want you to be. And they're not inserting things into your thoughts and your feelings and your expressions. One of the reasons I started avoiding folks was because they were trying to tell me what to feel, how to feel, and God was going to take care of it. And I was like, God is not taking care of this. And that was my answer. I was young and I was angry, and I was very much in church, and I very much loved the Lord. And I didn't think the Lord didn't love me. I was just saying, what you're trying to tell me, my brain is not able to process and compute that. But then, and I had a very good relationship with my pastor and his wife, and they were very supportive, and they were definitely leading me to scripture. And that was helping me keep my spirit in check, but it was not addressing this complicated, traumatic, unresolved PTSD grief that I was dealing with. I needed someone else to help me with that. I didn't need it and then it was too close because then it came with this pressure of having to go through the details all over again, talk about it all over again. And that was just creating more problems. So, right, I'm coming, but I'm not really connecting with people. So definitely, if you're most comfortable and you want spiritual counseling, you can do it. There's a lot of free ones. We can tell you about that, but you can do it with somebody that you feel most comfortable with. If you're open, there's also Christian therapists, and then there's individual therapists. But one of the ones that is super helpful and most helpful is actually group therapy. Most people shy away from it. They're scared of it. I have actually sent people to it, and they are usually extremely upset with me. My individual patients, they're like, I don't want to go. They go kicking and screaming. And they come back and say, Brandy, that was the best thing I ever did. I got to hear other people and their pain was familiar to me. And I was able to say, okay, now I can let my pain out and we can connect, and nobody's telling me that I have to do it their way. So those are a couple of things. The other thing is, if you're not ready for that, the first thing is sit down and move from the why to how will I live? How do I want to live? And that's it. I could do this all day, but we got time. We got to wrap up. Any question? And forgive me, I knew I lost a little bit of time, so that's why I was kind of like, let me get the most important stuff out of here that I felt like I was supposed to share.
No, thank you. So questions, anyone have any questions?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My question is around what to say. You were going through you put your mother loss, and you don't want people to come to you and ask you, well, what happened? What would you like for somebody to say to you in that particular situation? Or what should we say?
I think each person's different. For me, one, like I said, it was so shocking and numbing. And in hindsight, I get it now, what someone could have done. I was open at first until all of the questions kept. I was also getting overwhelmed, right? So let me just tie this into something because it's an important thing to understand. People need support. They don't always want to, they need it, but they don't always want it, but they do need it. So like, for example, this is the best way I could describe this. I need to be seen, but I don't always want to be seen, right? So how you approach me when I'm in pain and grieving matters. So if you take me to the side and give me that space and kind of just say, hey, I care about you, that is extremely different. Or I'm sorry about your loss. What do you need? I want to be there. Those things can help. What was happening was like I was already getting overwhelmed because when you're planning and doing all this, you guys know when you're like in the like first week of it, like there's so much going on. Even if you prepared all day long, like you're getting this done and these logistics, so and that was my role, right? I'm the only child. My grandmother was a mess because, you know, she wasn't expecting one of her kids to go first, right? We didn't have this in our brains. Now I know how to deal with it myself. But at the time, I'm also the person in my family that does everything. So obviously I'm doing all this, something I've never done. And I'm dealing with 2 different states because my mom was in another state. It was a lot going on. So people coming and asking me the details, and then people coming in like in family talking about like, you know, the details of what happened and what they wanted to happen to the person. That was not helpful. So I just started to kind of I didn't even realize I was doing it, right? But think of like, I don't know if you guys have ever watched The Simpsons, but there's this little meme or reel online where Bart, I think it is, Homer, one of them kind of disappears in this bush, like, I'm out. That's kind of what I was doing. I was like, okay, this is way too much going on. And I was young at the time for sure. So I kind of started disappearing in the bush. Had people kind of been very different about it, I think I would have responded differently. So for me, that would have helped.
I need to, I just want to also add too, in regards to that question, we recently had an incident, unfortunately, in our workspace on this past week with a fellow employee, and so that response came up, and then there was a response to that response, and the response was, instead of asking what happened, the desired response or the best response would be, what do you need?
Yes.
So don't ask what happened, because you know what happened.
Right. Remember I said that why is our human nature.
Happened, but what do you need?
Yeah, we're programmed for the why. That's our human nature, is why versus what happened.
So
Or what do you need?
Mike, this question regards how do I live with this?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this goes back to my parents. My question comes from the perspective of caregiver. I was caregiver to my mom. The morning that she passed, she was in the hospital. I was on my way to work. I stopped at the hospital. And she passed while I was there. I felt that maybe if I hadn't put her in the hospital, maybe if I'd put her in a different hospital, maybe if I had stayed with her overnight, all these things, okay? I couldn't understand why she literally passed in front of me. She literally stopped breathing while I was in her room, telling her I was going to fix things, fussing with the nurse because I felt the nurse wasn't doing something proper. Mm-hmm. This was very traumatic for me, okay? Then my dad, caregiver. I was administering the medication. I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Let it happen in your chest.
Because I can't live with it. And part of the reason I can't celebrate the birthday is because I'm still trying to understand how it happened and how I go on, because I feel that if I had maybe not given him medication or had given him a smaller dose or had taken him back to the hospital where he did not want to go again, if I'd done any of those things, or if we hadn't put him in the ambulance to go to dialysis while he was sleeping, not realizing that he wasn't breathing,
that he would have lived to make it to his 102nd birthday. And then hearing my husband say, it's nothing you did. It was time. And that God took him.
That's tough.
It's not that you did anything wrong, that it was just his time. And I've lived with this, or I tried to, but I feel guilt and I can't get over it. And I look at him and I say, if I had just done something or not done something that I did do, he would have made it to 102 because it wasn't his time. It was something I did. So how do I live with that?
I have two answers. One, you are living with it. And remember I said there's these things called complicators. And one of the complicators that you just absolutely explained so well is the personalization of what preceded this is why it was caused, and what preceded it is not the cause. And there's a couple of other complicators I heard, so I want to be mindful and careful. When did this happen?
2.5 years ago.
2.5 years ago. So I'm going to explain it in a different way. So one is 2.5 years ago, and two things occurred. And like the gentleman, I don't know where he went into that, but when you're replaying over and over and over again things in your head and remembering and kind of challenging what you do know, what you don't know, and you're it's just kind of reliving over and over and over again, that's grief, but that's actually what I didn't all the way go into, what we would call traumatic grief. So traumatic grief is what's keeping it going, and that's going to require therapeutic support. Family members, like I said, they can be helpful. And I was mindful about this, but I'm going to tell the truth. What was not helpful for me was hearing what God did or didn't do in the church. That made it worse. It made me kind of keep going with it. And it was creating more traumatic symptoms in me, because then now I'm kind of wrestle with why this, that, and the third, right? So there's what we call traumatic grief. And one way to explain this is if we ever injure ourselves, if we have a baby, usually we heal in 6 to 8 weeks. If there's complications after that, we know that there's some things that still need to be repaired. If we ever experience something, death or anything else that's still causing and wreaking havoc on us after 6 to 8 weeks, that's when we know that is trauma. And that's when we know we need some additional support. And we need some support outside of ourselves. And we need it soon. Does that make sense? Was that helpful? And I can talk with you one-on-one. I just want to be mindful not to open up a whole lot in here. But and one of the things I do want to say thank you for, and China knows I have a lot to say about this, but I'm so grateful for the intersection of theology and psychology at this time in this space. When my situation happened, it was not going on to this degree. I mentioned my first lady and pastor because my first lady ended up going back to school before I left Denver. I'm from Denver. And she started going to school and understanding it and tying it together to where we were able, whereas as Christians at whatever denomination, but when we tie the church into theology, or when we take theology and it kind of doesn't align with psychology, it's very difficult for people because they're tying two things together. And now they're learning how to work in harmony and create some separation there a little bit, because it's very difficult when you tie those two together. But in this space, bringing people in and bringing mental health people in who are also Christians, saying, hey, while we got our spiritual stuff, we do have some other stuff that you can't see. Physically, if I said something's going on with me, I'd immediately go get help. But mentally, I'm supposed to just not deal with this. I'm supposed to just pray my way through it, and it's going to go away. And it doesn't work like that all the time. Usually it never works like that. So those things all go together. And all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. And the way I treat my patients is in that way. I say, if you show me all the parts of me you don't love, I will know where to begin. So it's the same thought process. And I know she's giving me the sign to wrap up. Yes, ma'am.
Great day, everybody. I have a statement, God laid it on my heart. I've been losing close friends and family members since like 6 years old. I'm 52. And one thing that my elders within my family group, also I'm a child of the village raised. So I've had the opportunity of God putting people in my place that gave me a lot of knowledge. During the difficult things that I've gone through, and even with my children, because I have 7 children now, they're experiencing the same thing since they were small loss. One thing that they instilled in me, and even God says to me consistently every year, the day that we open our eyes to the day that our eyes are closed, our books are already written. So as we sit up there and we go through the grief and everything, we have to remind ourselves that that life, it was already written. So there's nothing that you can say or nothing that you can do to make that any different. I don't know if that can help help somebody here today. But the fact that they say, that they instill that in me, it helps me when I go through that grief process, because I got that understanding that, it will come to pass, like it's for all of us.
Well, I'll say this, and then I think I have to go. But I love that that's your support, your coping skill, and it works well for you. I will also say that's a great coping skill if it works. It doesn't always work that way for everyone. And in therapy, I absolutely challenge that to say your story is already written. There's parts of your stories that's written, but I also say, if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. And if you're at peace, you're living in the here and now. Why depressed? Because it's something that happened that you can't change and you wish you could have changed. I wish I would have did this. I wish I would have done that. And that is something that you can't just take your brain away from and say, I'm not going to do this if that person's there. Some people are not there, but if that person's brain is saying over and over and over again, it's not a I won't, or it's not a I won't try and get there and be okay and be in the here and now and understand my story. It's a I can't. And more often than not, particularly in Black communities, but particularly in church, we feel like we're not supposed to, so then we don't ask for help. And then we kind of just stick with it in our brain. So anybody that is having that going on, there's nothing wrong with you. It's what happened to you and what's happening inside of you. And that needs to be very, 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 very much acknowledged and healed. I will also say personality has roots in childhood. So the things that happen along the way absolutely can define how we deal with things when they come later on. And as far as future, if I'm all the way in, like if I'm already waiting for 4 years out for things to get better, then I'm going to be anxious because I don't have any control over that. But I absolutely have the ability to sit down and say, you know what I have? I have now. I have now. I have nothing else, but I have now. And this moment in time, I am standing in front of you all, talking about grief and writing my story. And I hope you all write your story too.
So again, thank you again. I wanted to add as well too, one of the things that I'm a very visual person. I like to use analogies, especially when working with individuals. And thank you, Brandy, because one of the things she talked about that river. And so I began to think about that river a little bit and how I could, steal that a little bit and talk about it. I thought about, if you think about a river, I mean, I'm not a rafter, but I know that, I've gone to see the water. And I know that when there are rocks in the water, like boulders and rocks, what happens? How does that? It disrupts the flow, right? So if we think about grief, when we think about that flow, the more boulders and rocks that we have in our river, and I want you to think about those boulders and rocks as being our unresolved trauma, our unresolved hurts, our unresolved pains. So when we don't do the work to take those boulders out, do the work to heal and take them out of our river, that's going to disrupt the flow. That's going to disrupt the flow of our own healing, of our own growth, right? So I think when we get in these situations where we experience kind of being stuck, right? I think oftentimes that we have a lot of boulders that sometimes we need to go back and we need to re-examine what's blocking the flow, right? So again, but thank you, Brandy, for that presentation. I'm not sure where we are time-wise, so I guess that we're gonna. If there's any additional questions, there are note cards that are all scattered throughout, especially on the tables in the back. So you may have questions. Please feel free to, if you don't want to personally address them out loud in this forum, feel free, write them down on the note cards, and then at some point we'll gather those up, and then we can, make sure that we try to address those before we close out for the day. Okay.